Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Tech Talk Live. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Tech Talk Live, this is a monthly session that we host here at Alfresco. It's a variety of topics. We kind of go over things that are the most relevant, things that are the most interesting. So every month we're joined by different members of the team or the community who present on new functionality. So this month we're going to be talking about the new deployment mechanism for ACS. We're joined by 3 members of the engineering team. I'm going to let the guys introduce themselves on their own in just a moment. I did want to go over a few announcements as we get started. So in addition to our monthly Tech Talk Lives, which are the second Wednesday of every month, we also do office hours on the last Friday of every month. So we are currently scheduled for May 25th as of right now for our next office hours. We're hoping to make an announcement at our next office hours. So I'm waiting on some legal things to come through before that. So if we have to push out, we'll push out to June 1st. But mark your calendars for either May 25th or June 1st for the next office hour session. And we will have Tech Talk Live again in June. Additionally, in June, we have 2 meetups. So if you are in Berlin or in Paris, there are 2 meetups happening, one on June 19th and one on June 20th. And we would love for you to join either our partners at ATOL or at IT Novum. So all that information can be found on our community website. It's community.alfresco.com. Today for Tech Talk Live, if you do have questions, Francesco and myself will be managing the IRC chat as well as the YouTube chat channel. You can just post your questions there and we'll ask the guys as we go through the presentation. If you have questions that we don't get to, you can always post them in the community or we'll post them in the community and answer them afterwards as well. Usually Tech Talk Live is pretty full of content, but we'll try to get to everything as we can. So I'll hand over to you, Francesco, now for introductions.
Thank you very much, Kristen. Just a very fast reminder also for the next week, because we as Alfresco together with IT Novum will be at the We Are Developers Conference in Vienna. So if you are around there, there are more than 2,000 developers per day in this 3 days event. So if you are around there, please join us to our booth. I will be there, Kristen will be there, the IT Novum guys will be there, so also with the talk, so we will be happy to stay together. But I don't want to lose time. Just to introduce myself, I'm Francesco Corti, Product Evangelist for Alfresco. I will be here to help you to raise questions. So please raise questions to the YouTube chat and the RC channel. I'll leave the mic to the content, because today, let me say, it's a really exciting timing, because we will show in practice the new deployment mechanism of the Alfresco content services. So we'll leave the mic to Ray Gauss, architect for Alfresco, then the other guys will introduce themselves. Thank you, Ray.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Ray Gauss, as mentioned, architect for platform services. Been with the company since 2011 and was a community contributor before that. And happy to be joining you guys on Tech Talk Live.
Hey, guys. Great to be here again. I'm Sergiu Vidrascu. I'm an engineer in the platform services team. I've been working with Alfresco for about 3 years, and now excited to update our deployment mechanism. So with that being said, passing to Alexandru.
Thank you. Hello, guys. I'm happy to be here. It's my first time on Tech Talk Live. I'm a junior Java developer for Alfresco. This is my first job, and I've been in the company for about 2 years. I'm going to present some interesting stuff that we have done. So I'm happy to be here. Going to pass it to Ray.
All right, thank you. Let's share my screen here and take you guys through a few things. All right.
Yes, we can see your screen, Ray.
Excellent. So I wanted to take a minute to talk about why we chose to focus on deployment, not just for the Tech Talk Live, but in general, why did we feel a need to really improve our deployment story around the digital business platform? And really, as I started thinking about this, it could be boiled down into 2 main points here: the complexity and the consistency. And those of you that have been doing this for a while can remember back to old days of a single war, where we were deploying everything in a single war, in a single Tomcat instance, and we'd have the user interface embedded and search, and everything was in a simple little war. And obviously, the platform has evolved since then. We've got a lot more things that are separated out, a lot of different components that we have to keep track of. So that becomes more and more difficult to deploy as that infrastructure evolves, and that's likely to increase over time. We'll be adding things like a message bus, for example, and we'll continue to evolve this platform into more of a microservice-like architecture. So that deployment of those multiple artifacts and components does become increasingly difficult. And then we need to accommodate the addition of new components and products, and not just ourselves providing new ones, but yourselves as customers, starting on ACS, for example, and then bringing in APS or vice versa for content and process needs. So we need to accommodate that as well. And obviously, we need to address the scalability and availability. These are things that can become difficult in environments to be able to support. And sometimes people are trying to do this sort of thing manually, but we need an easy way to be able to accommodate those capabilities in a running deployment in particular. And then the consistency side of things. Of course, we want consistency of the deployment across our products. And almost as important, or perhaps more importantly, is a consistency across environments. All too often, we have a development environment where we've manually installed lots of different components to get an entire stack working, and then we run it in tests and it didn't work at all. And right, that's the old classic line of "worked on my machine," right? Well, we want to try to help eliminate that sort of thing. So a much closer, at least, environment across development, test, and production. And we need this thing, obviously, to be repeatable, right? Long gone are the days of us logging into a server to edit some config files and restarting a service. That doesn't fly anymore in 2018. We need a repeatable, configuration-driven deployment that we can, again, consistently repeat across different environments as well. And when you have that consistency, it becomes easier to learn these sorts of things, right? If you've got different ways of doing it in different products, or different ways to do it in development and test and production, or even just so many different options, if you're brand new to the platform of trying to do this stuff, it makes it much easier to learn if there's a single way to do all this stuff. And of course, it also helps support to be able to understand an environment. It can take a while sometimes for a new support call, let's say, for a fairly new customer to try to describe the environment and how these different pieces are configured to talk to each other. So it obviously eliminates a lot of that as well, to have that consistent deployment. So you guys have probably heard that we're leaning towards containers and Kubernetes and Helm. We've come quite a long way here. And I want to talk a little bit about the specifics of Kubernetes and Helm and how they solve some of these problems. So those of you that don't know, Kubernetes is for the orchestration side of these containers. So it's managing nodes and containers, the services for container communication, ingresses into those services from outside the cluster, for example, and managing volume. So some of this you can do with other packages as well, but Kubernetes is pretty elegant in its management of those sorts of things. And then Helm is on the packaging side. So that's going to bundle up a lot of that deployment and service and volume definition. And it also manages dependencies or requirements, as they call them. And it allows for a much easier management of values and overriding those values. And then perhaps most importantly is the idea of releases and being able to upgrade a Helm release and roll back these releases as well. It's pretty important stuff. So again, this helps solve these problems because we're doing an easier definition of a coordination of multiple different components in a single deployment. This also allows us to develop a common infrastructure. So across, say, ACS, or content and process services, we're able to have a common infrastructure for those pieces that both of them share. And it is easier to support a consistent way to do scalability, availability of these systems at the different levels of the architecture, depending on what's needed for the load of the environment, for example. And again, we can then have far fewer differences between our development, test, and production environments, and that potential for an easier handoff to support for understanding how this environment is set up and configured. with that, I'll pass to Sergiu, unless there are any questions.
No, we can go ahead. Thank you very much, Ray. Really useful, this high overview. We don't have a question at the moment, but again, feel free to raise question, the RC channel or the YouTube chat. What I can say is that there are lots of people on the mic. This means that the topic is really interesting. I would like to remind this is a really brand new deployment mechanism that has been introduced since Alfresco 6th version. So really excited to hear about this news. So we'll leave the mic to Sergiu. Sergiu, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Francesco. So I think for those of you that actually are coming from the Docker world, maybe you're more familiar with Docker Compose. I mean, we picked up Kubernetes because it just offers so much more out of the box, and for some people, it's a bit hard to grasp all the concepts of Kubernetes. But when just going into it, you'll see that it's not really that much of a big deal. So, for example, if you take a pod, it's almost similar to a container, but it's much more similar to a host, to your VM where you actually run your containers. Kubernetes says that this is actually the logical host for your application. So you can have multiple containers within that pod, and that logical object can be replicated and multiplied and scaled without any issues in Kubernetes. Kubernetes also comes with high availability out of the box, with very minimal settings required to actually make it that way, with the health services that check for your application if it's alive, if it's ready, and also with quite a few modules that help your actual application interact with each other through services that can either be just within the cluster, so no access from outside, or maybe some of those you want actually access to the outside world, where you can it gives you the possibility of doing path rewriting very easy. So, and it has integration with a lot of cloud providers. We have been doing a lot of work with Amazon Web Services in this area, where the implementation with Kubernetes is actually very good, where you can basically deploy everything along to an ELB that handles all your application and routes the user to the different applications within your deployment, or direct sync with Route 53, for example, with DNS and all the other services within Amazon, like EFS and all that good stuff that Amazon provides. Now, Helm actually acts as an overlay over Kubernetes, because although Kubernetes is great by itself, when it comes to dealing with a big application with a lot of services like we have, and across the whole DBP, we have process, we have content, we have a hell of a lot of other applications that run with it, databases and transformation services. So when it comes to that, it's Kubernetes by default, its way of actually handling all that complexity is not really that ideal. So that's where Helm comes in and just helps us eliminate that complexity and better structure everything, so that it makes a lot of sense for us, and it helps us within the providing repeatable application installation. Also, Helm takes a lot of the pain out of the updates, because it offers you a release. So when you do a deployment, you have a certain point in time where you have a T0. This is your release right now. You use all this configuration. You have it here. And if you want to upgrade, okay, I'm going to change one configuration. I'm going to have another release, but at any point in time, you can just switch back to the old configuration and head over forward again. Helm just makes it very easy with a couple of concepts, mainly named hooks, so that between these upgrades, you can even do backups, you can restore backups, and basically it just makes the whole process a lot easier when you're deploying or when you're developing also. Because if you're writing something in a Docker container, for example, in your application, it's just as easy. Just do Helm upgrade. It's gonna take the old container down. It's gonna put in the new image tag that you send as a configuration, and everything just works. And also Helm, it's very easy to share. I'll share the screen now to actually show you more about our ACS Helm chart. Okay, let me take this out. Hope you can see my screen. So Helm also makes it easy to share all of this deployment configuration. And you can store it privately. You can host a server for Helm. It's very easy to do that. We actually have one on GitHub, on GitHub pages, and it's just very simple to do that. And it's just cool. Now I'll show you on ACS how we actually structure all of this deployment. As you can see here, we have all of our components that are currently in the content services application, repo, share, and all the other stuff. Now, if you're familiar with Kubernetes, if you just go into one of those deployments, for example, you're basically going to see the manifest for deployment, which is exactly the same as in Kubernetes. Now, however, Helm gives you a lot more power over it with templating. Now, you can interact with all of this, all the components of the application through templates, through values that you set defaults to, for example, where we have all these defaults for our applications, or yeah, just generate your own templates if you want something specific. Now, configuration. We store configuration, for example. This is a very good example for repository configuration. We have here a couple of Catalina options, which are set by default just to do the linking between the application. As you can see here, share, for example, and the database. But also, anyone that wants to add additional configuration, they can just do it by modifying the values, and that can be done either by modifying this value file, or just by doing a Helm install and just set a different value file. It's that easy, and you can do upgrades between the deployments that are already there within the releases just by modifying this value file from a single location. So no more going to the machine, go there, fix that, turn that other thing around. No, you have a single location, you have a values file with your configuration. You can push that to whichever cluster you need or deployment that you have. Now, aside from this, there are all the other components here in the ACS chart that just help this work better. Services, for example, here we have services that give up to the cluster. This is my address where content services repository is working. You can access me here at this port. Now, you have a choice of making this public or not. We chose to keep everything inside, mainly for security, and everything that we get outside of the cluster, it's handled through the ingress. The ingress controller is a component that does routing for the application, and we also actually set SSL on this level, so that everything coming through the ingress controller is and coming out of the ingress controller is secure. Well, with that being said, if there aren't any questions right now, I can answer by the end. I'll pass to Alexandru. I know he has some cool stuff to show you also, and I don't want to take too much of his time.
No, thank you very much, Sergiu. Really interesting. People loves a lot to see hands-on. Let me. There is one question that is quite complex, so I will share a brief introduction. Probably some of you are aware that an early access program, so it's a public space into our community portal, hosting some tutorial just to show how to deploy ACS using Docker and Kubernetes in the way that the guys here are helping us to understand. We define the tutorial, driving the developers on trying the Docker deployment and the Kubernetes deployment using Minikube. Minikube is the, let me say, version for developers, the version for a laptop, and not really scalable. But I will leave you, Sergiu, a brief introduction to Minikube because you are the expert more than me. In any case, especially talking about the Minikube and how Minikube is related to Kubernetes. And Sergiu, if you could give some color about it, will be really appreciated. One of the questions is if there are any concern using the native Kubernetes support in Docker for Mac. That is should be the Edge release, not the stable or the latest release. Can you take this question?
Okay.
And
No problem.
Thank you very much.
First off, to talk a bit about Minikube. Well, Minikube is basically a simplified version of the Kubernetes cluster that you can have. In Docker, if you use that before, you would have Docker machines, for example, right? Well, this is basically the same thing with Minikube, but all the internal components of the Kubernetes clusters are already deployed in there. So you have a development cluster to work with. But of course, since we don't have machines with so much memory to spin up all the world in that Minikube, we tend to use Amazon or other cloud providers to do that, and it's sometimes a bit faster also. But there's not too much of a difference, but when you between a cloud provider, Kubernetes, and Minikube. However, when you deal with the resources that are used by cloud provider, of course, it's a different story there, because if you want safe storage in an EFS server, or you want to use an ELB from a different cloud provider, it changes everything, right? Also certificates and persistence, like I said. Now, we actually initially started doing this locally with Minikube, but we also tried out the Edge version. It seems to have been working fine for us. We didn't really make any assumptions about that and announcement about that because it didn't went to stable yet. But I can tell you that we tried it and it seems to be working. But we're for too many applications, we highly recommend that you actually use a cloud provider for this.
Okay, thank you for sharing. In the meantime, another question in the YouTube chat, and please don't stop to raise questions because this is the interesting part of the Tech Talk Live, so we have the chance to discuss with the engineering directly. Another question is if there are any plans to improve how Alfresco handles database migration so that we can do progressive rollout of a newer version. Is it clear enough, Sergiu?
Yeah, I understand. Yeah,
in the meantime, Sergiu, if you want to stop screen sharing, you can see probably.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we are actually looking forward to doing that. It's a very important. It's very important for us that everybody can easily upgrade. And of course, we're gonna try to do that with Kubernetes and Helm. We have a few ideas on how to do that, but we're still working on it. But definitely, migration is an important thing for us, and we will be working on that as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think we can pass the mic to Alexandru. Thank you again, Sergiu. We appreciate it. And Alexandru, it's your turn. Let's show us what you have for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Let's start with the GitHub project. So for we have two deployment projects. One is for community and one is for enterprise. The projects are named ACS deployment and ACS community deployment, the community counterpart. Here we have a simple project structure. We have a Docker Compose folder where we have the Docker Compose file that we recommend for our reference deployment. There is a Helm folder which contains the Helm charts. If we look, for example, on a Docker Compose file, we will see that we have all these image tags that we are using here. So if we look onto this project and the community counterpart has the same thing, we see this customizing the Alfresco deployment, and we have this tags. This is a hyperlink which points out to our Docker Hub repository here under the this point to the image tags, the image that we have selected. So for example, this is the content repository one. But if we want to see all the images, all the Docker images that are available on Alfresco, we can click on the Alfresco organization, and we can see here that we have the search services images, the Alfresco share images. But another thing that I want here to make a note, an observation, you will see that the content repository, the community, and the enterprise part have a latest tag on these images. The latest tag contains the features that are not completely released in the RC, so it's a work in progress. But this is a floating tag, so it will change by the time. As you can see here, latest was put 3 hours ago. This is all available right now only for the repository images. For example, if you go on to share, we will see that there is no latest tag here. Let's get back to these projects, these GitHub projects. I can close this one. Here we have a great README MD. Let's start with the Helm part. So Docker and Kubernetes. Okay. This is Helm part. So we have a lot of documentation. We use Minikube in our testing, and we document how to use Minikube. Here is how to set up a Minikube. Also, there is another project, the Alfresco DBP deployment. This is the whole digital business platform. You can find here a lot of useful information, like the recommended Docker version, Kubernetes version, Helm version, and Minikube version that we use, and we test with them. And here you have, for example, how to create a Kubernetes cluster. So these two, the README MDs, these two repository make the magic happen. So let's go. Let's get into the Helm part. So what I have prepared today is a configured cluster on AWS. So how do we do this? We start with anything Helm. After we do that, we configure the I have here set. I have here an PowerShell. So after this, we should configure our local Kubernetes to point to the Kubernetes cluster, and I have done this already. Are a few commands that we need to run. So for example, let's take one of these and put it in. I'm going to make this bigger. Let's see. I'll break something. Okay.
Thank you, because in this way we can see very well also the command line and the tool.
Yeah, so So we have three commands that we usually run. We have kubectl config, and we set the cluster. We put the server address, and after this one, this is not complete. There are those are two-line command. Sorry. Then we put the certificate authority, which is a local file containing this certificate authority. So we need to connect to the Kubernetes cluster. We need to set up this, and then this is not the most efficient way of doing things. Then we set the context, because in a cube file we can have different context and we can switch between them. So for example, here I'm using the platform services dev alfresco.me cluster. I'm using platform services dev.alfresco.me user. The namespace is actually wrong here. I'm using another one, but this is the previous one that I broke today. And then the third command for pointing to that cluster is actually setting up the user, because we have set up this server and the things that the connection and the certificate. So here we set the credentials, and we have the client certificate, client key, username, and password. And after we run this, I'm going to show how a file, where it is on Windows. So it is somewhere in the cube. Hope this. I think I deleted everything. Nope, not this one. No, I don't have. Is this config file here that contain that all the data that we have added will be added there. So the right way is running these three commands. After this, we will see we will run kubectl proxy. I have run this into an CMD, an administrator CMD, and we can go into the this one. We can go into the Kubernetes dashboard that we have. Onto the Kubernetes dashboard, I have created a new namespace. It's Alex E. I have selected this namespace. If we go onto the overview, we will see that everything is green, which is nice. Then we can go onto the pods, and we can see the deployed pods that we have here. So what I have done after in this dash, the command that I have done was to actually, let's go into the deployment project, is actually deploy the Alfresco, the ACS, the Alfresco Content Services solution. So it's some sort of this command. We have a more complicated one that we use. It's this one. It's bigger. It uses a namespace that the namespace that we have defined, which is Alexi. Pretty nice command, and this actually deployed all that we have seen, all that we see here.
So just to interject a bit here and give some others a little more context on the call that may not be all that familiar with Kubernetes. One thing that's really nice is, so you've got your Kubernetes cluster, and that's kind of a one-time setup, right? And then we saw that we were setting up the context and config around accessing that cluster. And then we've also seen that we can have different namespaces within a cluster. So we expect it'll be pretty common that you'll have kind of a development team that needs to access the cluster. And again, the cluster being the kind of nodes, the AWS EC2 instances, the hardware running this stuff. And then you can deploy independent namespaces. So one person could be working on one feature set that involves, as we can see here, lots of different pods and services connecting the two, and a completely different namespace for a different user or developer that wants to deploy their stuff, and they don't step on each other's toes. So you can have one set of kind of infrastructure and cluster to use, and simplify that complexity and save money on resources and in things like AWS, and have lots of different developers deploying their solutions without stepping on each other's toes.
Okay, thank you for that, Ray. So after we run that command, we will wait a little bit for the pods to get up, for the pods to get starting, and if we go into the ingress controller, there's this first link that is an external endpoint, for example, and actually, what this is the address where the Alfresco solution was deployed. And as you can see here, we have an Enterprise 600 RC4. And we have two clusters of Alfresco running right here. As you can see, we have validated this cluster. If we go, let's say we want share, we type /share, and we can see that share is working. So again, meanwhile, we can see that if we go search /solar, that solar is working properly against our ACS deployment. So we can search here for wind example, wind turbine. Come on. And we can see that that our transformers are working. Okay. If we go to pods, so we can show a little bit of Kubernetes magic. We see here that we have 2 repository pods. If we go onto each pod, for example, if we go onto the logs, we can see the Alfresco logs. So everything is here. Also, what we can do is actually kill pod. And we can see, so one should I refresh this? One pod should be killed, and another. So this pod was killed because I deleted it. But and we can see here that we have another repository pod. So Kubernetes assures us that if we want 2 pods, there will be always 2 pods. So it doesn't matter what happens, it breaks, if we kill it, Kubernetes would automatically spin up another Alfresco instance for us. Yeah, so I think that's all for Kubernetes. I'm not sure if I'm missing anything.
Yeah, we also actually have this environment. As I told you, it's very easy to link everything to Route 53 and EFS. Persistence in the current environment is actually handled through EFS. All the application write into specific folders on an Amazon EFS instance, and you can actually access, as you see on Alex's screen. It's actually very easy to set up DNS entries directly through Kubernetes and assign certificates from Amazon or your private certificates if you want.
So I understand that you show the major stuff. So if you want, I can start with some question. And there are lots of activities and YouTube chat mainly. So I lost one question when Sergiu, when managing the first wave of questions. So one of the questions is about the migration. So you were talking about the DB migration improvements, and you talk about minor upgrades or major upgrades and stuff like that. So just a confirmation, will those DB migration improvements only for minor upgrades, or is planned to do also for major upgrades, if you're aware, Sergiu?
Yeah, sadly, I'm not aware of that information so far, but we'll keep you updated.
Yeah. Fair answer about that. Another question is, this is to say, just to confirm this is to say that you can see the latest and the greatest because we are touching with our hands the latest release of the deployment mechanism. But of course, there are lots of things and details to cover more, and we will do, and we are doing in the next release in the next time. Another question is probably for Alexandru, but Sergiu or Ray, tell me if you want to take these to complete the answer. Is from Sergiu about Docker. So did we test, so which is the version of Docker that we are using, or we suggest to use? More in particular, the question is if we use Docker Enterprise 2.0 for Enterprise, or which version of Docker we used?
Neither of those.
Okay.
So we haven't used Docker Enterprise, and we haven't tested anything on Swarm.
Ah, so you are anticipating the other question. So let me share the other question for the audience. So the other question is if we tested or certified in some way the Docker Compose with Swarm or orchestration rather than Kubernetes. And so Sergio gave the answer that we didn't test with this part. Thank you, Sergio, for that.
Yeah, no problem.
Another question, and feel free to raise new question if you have. Another question in the is about let me say a sort of best practices. Alexandru, you were showing that the Docker or the Kubernetes, I don't remember exactly, is using the latest version, so the latest release during the deployment. Which is the release that has been used? The stable release, the nightly build, which is the latest version that has been used from the script, the Helm script and the deployment mechanism? If you are aware.
So if we go into the ACS deployment, these charts, so in the Alfresco content services, if we go, I think, into the values.yaml, we use the versions that are already released. So we use latest only for testing features. So when we develop a feature, we would like to spin up a Docker environment and a Helm environment and test that the feature works properly. So on our ACS deployment, we recommend only using the released images. So.
Okay. So I hope that this is a question from Bindu. So I hope we cover also this topic. In the meantime, the list of questions from the chat is finished, but I have one question for you. Before, let me.
Yeah, I think Francesco, Alexandru was actually planning on showing you some more stuff on Docker Compose also.
Okay.
So if you want, he can show us that. But to keep in mind, we're mostly referencing and recommending the Kubernetes Helm deployment and the Docker Compose as you get it. So.
Okay, and let me. I will leave you the mic, Alexandru, soon, because again, you are the top contributor. So I mean, it's interesting what you are showing. Let me introduce that in the next weeks, an early access program is ongoing into the community space, where you can again test this kind of deployment. You following a tutorial. So there are some questions there that I would like also to submit to your attention, because probably it's an interesting discussion here. But yes, again, this invitation is for all of you guys that you are hearing this webinar. If you want to understand more and try in practice, you can try to follow this part and this early access program that is nothing more and nothing less than a tutorial showing how to deploy using Docker and Kubernetes plus Helm in your environment. So I will leave the mic to Alexandru to cover more content, more interesting content. Thank you, Sergio, for the heads up.
Okay, so thank you. I'm going to present now a simple deployment of Docker Compose. So what I have locally is I have downloaded 3 hours ago the ACS community deployment project, the master one. And if I go into the Docker Compose, and I usually use and also recommend the Git bash for this. Let's make the text a little bit bigger. So if you run a Docker PS, we see that we don't have any containers here. What I have done to this Docker Compose, as you can see, there are 2 folders here. I have actually, it was a request from the community. We had some problems with it and we identified the problems. I have added volumes to this image. So to the Alfresco image, I'm pointing the alf data. I'm taking the alf data from the container and storing it into the folder here. So this is only an example, and I'm doing the same for the the Postgres image. This is actually something that you can find on the internet. So I have added these two here. If again, let's make this full screen. If we run a docker ps-a, so we don't have any containers, which have this. Okay, cool. So we don't have any containers. Nothing is up, and I'm going to run a docker -compose up. So I'm going to run the environment. I'm not going to use -d for the detach mode because I want to see the logs. And right now we're going to wait, I think, for about a minute. Meanwhile, what we can expect from these Docker Compose on Windows. So by default, Docker creates a machine that has 2 cores and 2 gigabytes of RAM. And if you add to our Docker Compose, if you add volumes or other containers, you can suddenly see containers crashing. So we need to actually increase the RAM amount. So on Windows is by going into the Hyper-V manager window and going to move it to the other screen. And as you can see, this mobile Linux VM, you need to stop this, go into the properties settings here. And wow, I have 2 gigabytes, yes. I usually go for 4 or 6 gigabytes. I think the 4 is the minimum recommended for an ACS deployment, Docker Compose deployment, and go for 4 cores. If you have more, give more. It will move faster, and it will work properly. So let's come back to our deployment. So as we can see, did Alfresco start up? It's in the process of starting up. Now we should go to localhost and verify and wait for our Alfresco instance, for example. Meanwhile, we should start a share one. Please note that in the Docker Compose, we have different ports for Alfresco share, and I think for Solar, it's 8083. So Solar is up, apparently is running without any problems. Thank you, demo gods. And waiting for the other containers. And what I want to show after the environment is up, I want to create a folder and add some data to our Alfresco instances using share. Then show we had this question into the community, why I cannot restart the Docker Compose environment. The answer is because we do not have persistency. So if I add these volumes and I restart the Docker Compose after I add some data, the stop and the start will work properly, and the data will still be there. So this is something another step that you need to do for a Docker Compose environment. Well, I shouldn't put 2 gigabytes of RAM onto that machine.
This is to demonstrate how many resources we need to run this kind of stuff.
Yes. So actually, I have reduced. I should close some tabs here to free up some space. I actually have reduced the Docker machine memory and CPU when I installed Minikube because I didn't have enough RAM on my computer. You can go with 2 gigabytes or 14 gigabytes using onto the Minikube cluster. And
in the meantime, in the YouTube chat, there has been a discussion around compressing the dimension of the images because we worked also on this kind of compression. Now the images are around 700 megabyte. That is a quite good result. I will raise one question about the Kubernetes storage classes, but I will raise the question after, because of course, before we would like to see and hear about the Docker Compose stuff and result. I see that Docker is going up and the log is going ahead in the description. Tell me, Alexandru, if you want me to raise the question or you prefer to wait for the conclusion of the Docker Composer.
No, please raise the question.
Okay, so the question from Ivan, I don't know if you will take this or Sergiu will take this. So what are the recommended Kubernetes storage classes for persistent data on-premise deployments, for example, for Solar, Indents, Content Store, DB? Is it clear, the question, Sergiu or Alexandru?
Yeah, it is.
Is it a difficult question, Alexandru?
Yes,
Sergiu?
It's a good question. Well, we actually haven't done any research for now on premise. I can tell you that in Amazon, we're not using the default storage class, which is EBS, but we're using the NFS provisioner and defining a volume with that, connecting to an EFS instance, because EBS is not stable enough. And if you want to do clustering with Alfresco, where you want multiple pods to connect to the same content store, then you would have problems with EBS, because it only has a one-to-one link, EBS link to one EC2. So if Kubernetes decides to schedule your pod on another node, and that one tries to read from the CVS, everything crashes. So yeah, I'm sorry I cannot answer you to this on premise. Maybe next time.
Thank you, Sergiu.
The answers are going to be very similar to what we'd recommend with a kind of direct on-premise deployment as well, right? I think there were some details in the question around the indexes versus content store and that sort of thing. So it's not going to be that much different than you would expect for, a traditional stack on-prem. You're going to have to think of those same guidelines and storage class needs for each of those different components and what your solution needs for your particular deployment. That makes sense. So there's a notion of custom storage classes as well in Kubernetes, right? So there's lots of different options there, and a lot of that will be unique to a particular environment.
Okay, so there is an ongoing discussion also on this point. I think that Alexandru, in the meantime, has the service up and running. Is it true, Alexandru?
Yes, but it's moving slowly because the Docker machine has low RAM. So what I recommend for the people out there, go to the ACS community deployment project, clone it, download it, and play with the Docker Compose. All you need to do if you want to have volumes is what I shown previously. It's pretty simple. I think we should add this into our documentation. It will be soon added. How to add volumes. It's with two lines and it will work. So I think that's all from me. The Alfresco is up, as you can see, but it's moving very slowly.
Okay, so, thank you very much, Alexandru. Just one question about the Docker Compose and setup. One question I saw from the early access program is how to set up if it's possible in Docker deployment to set up, and how it's possible to set up the HTTPS protocol instead of the HTTP. Is it possible? And can you spend some words on this? I don't know who wants to take the question.
Yeah, well, in Kubernetes, I showed you that, yeah, it's actually quite easy. It's just deployment of the ingress that it's different, and you'll actually find information on this if you go to the Alfresco DBP deployment repo. So in Kubernetes, we took the route of applying TLS at the ELB level through the ingress. If you want to do that on Docker Compose, actually Angel did something similar. It's very easy to just add another container with HA proxy or Nginx and do there the apply the SSL at the proxy level, and don't let anything else out except your proxy. So that should be good.
So just for the people that don't know who Angel is, I think the 2 or 3 in the world. Angel is one of our community star, Angel Borroy from Kingsoft, and he did a great job, and lots of, together with Michael Asler, that is in the YouTube chat, and all the team of Kingsoft, lots of experimentation on Docker since a long time. Another question follow up is about FSF, EFS. So is EFS being used for Alfresco parts or ACS content storage in containers? Is it clear, the question, Sergiu? Or so the question is from Michael Wallach. Is EFS being used for Alfresco parts or for ACS content storage in containers? Probably, Michael, you could explain a little bit more better the question. We can raise it again, because I see Sergiu's face is probably in doubt on that.
Yeah, it's not very clear for me, but so we're using EFS to store Solar data. We're using it to store database data, or all the applications that use a database. So, and also we're using EFS to store the content store, right? For APS, for example, we're using it to store database data and the custom content data from APS. So wherever we felt the need of storing data in order to have that, so if actually something dies, yeah, a pod, a deployment or something like that, it should be able to come up without any interference. That was the main idea. So everything we needed to actually persist on this, we sent it over to EFS.
Thank you. It seems that for Michael, Ray, do you want to add something?
Yeah, just to be clear that in future iterations for AWS deployments in particular, we would be looking to leverage the native services there. So rather than having Postgres store its data in EFS, recommending hooking up to an RDS database, for example, or Aurora, and similarly S3 connector for content storage, that sort of thing. So this initial iteration is just kind of saving all of that on EFS storage at the moment.
So do you think we can spend some minutes, because we are on top of the hour, and we all know, guys, that is an interesting topic. Probably we can talk more, and we will talk more about this in the next Tech Talk Live next month, because we will continue to talk about the new deployment mechanism, but from a development perspective. So any suggestion or insight or anticipation, probably you, Ray, about the next iteration? So what we are working, so which is the things we are working on this kind of stuff, because again, this is only the beginning of the journey. It's not the end of the journey, and we are happy about the beginning of this kind of journey. Any insights on that?
Well, as you mentioned, development will be key, and we're at a stage right now, as you mentioned, also with the early access program, where we're really looking to get some real world feedback on this stuff before dedicating too much time and resources and things that we're making assumptions would be the next priorities for people. So we really do want to get that, particularly around the development cycles, getting that information. So there's lots of stuff on the backlog, but we do want to get some feedback to be able to prioritize that properly, if that makes sense.
I think it's an amazing stuff, because again, deployment, it's also very useful for getting started and to deploy in production or in test or in development environment. But of course, we want also to be able to develop, to customize, and to use our ACS, in this case, stuff. So I think we are on top of the hour. Guys, I think that it has been a really interesting topic, and as you can see, lots of questions, lots of interest and discussion in the chat, this time mainly on the YouTube chat. I'm very, very happy about your contribution and the discussion around. Again, I would love to see more in the future, and we will have more in the future. I think that I will leave. I don't know if someone of you want to add something. Otherwise, I will leave the mic for the greetings. Anything from you to add or to?
Yeah, well, I
Yeah,
wonder
please.
if anyone has more questions, just to access the EA program and see, post more in there and under the Kubernetes deployment for me mainly. Alex on the Docker Compose, if they have some questions there. We'll be more than happy to answer you if we have answers, of course.
I think you have, and thank you very much for the invitation, because as Ray was saying, we are very happy to receive feedback from the community, and we are managing the feedback indirectly in the early access program and stuff. So, Kristen, do you want to close the...
Just the last thing, if you do want to join the EA program and you haven't had access to it yet, if you just go to community.alfresco.com, it's actually on the company and community news, so the very front landing page of the community, there's access to the group. It is a group, but it's not private, so there's no request to join. You can just go and download and play with everything there. And I guess we will talk to you guys at our next office hours will be the next one. Again, that's May 25 or June 1st. We'll keep you posted and let you know as soon as we are able to confirm that date. And again, if anybody's going to be in Vienna next week, we'd love to see you at the We Are Developers Conference. And that's it. Thanks, guys, for joining us. It's been a good one.
Thanks. Bye-bye.